So welcome everybody. I am thrilled, absolutely thrilled today to be interviewing my best friend, Julie Simons. But who cares if she's my best friend? What are we going to do for you is really the question that we want to answer. Well, Julie and I have conspired together and we have decided that we want to talk about how we give ourselves slack, grace, and space during a global pandemic. And before we get started, I'd just like to share a little bit with you about Julie's background. Julie is a licensed psychotherapist with a private practice in Sarasota. She's been doing that for over 25 years. She's also created an amazing online course entitled Chaos to Control, and that will be launched this summer. She's trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and offers a very solutions-based approach by giving people tools and concepts to manage their mind. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm so excited to be here and very honored that you asked me to share and connect with your students.
Well, we're honored to have you. And this has been part of an ongoing conversation that you and I have had. How do we give ourselves slack and grace and space when we are dealing with something that none of us have ever dealt with? How do we face the uncertainty and the fear that we all feel?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's kind of the big question that we're all asking ourselves and each other right now. You know, I heard something that really struck me the other day, just to maybe lead with this, is someone was telling a little story that just really hit me, that we actually live with profound uncertainty every single day. We never actually know, but it's kind of like on the beach when the surf is coming in and it looks so predictable, right? That the waves are coming in and we see, kind of that, just the feeling that we get when we're watching the surf. And then when the tide goes out, we see everything that was underneath, right? Everything that was happening under the water, that was always there. We just couldn't see it. And so I think a lot of what's happening here is that we've gotten, understandably, accustomed to our normal lives and the predictability. And so we don't realize how uncertain and fragile this life is. And I think this pandemic has really brought that to the fore for a lot of us. And we're seeing what's been under the water, and kind of there, and really, I think, challenged to ask this question, right? To bring this up, to have a discussion about how do we deal with uncertainty? Yeah, it's a good question.
I like your point that we're dealing with uncertainty all the time. I just feel personally that it's never been so much uncertainty about so many things in our lives. And
so true.
Yeah. So how do we, I love your idea of looking at things like, wow, we've got this really big opportunity to look closely at what is underneath the surface once the water leaves. How do we apply that, though, to feeling a sense of security, if that's even possible, or rootedness in the midst of feeling like we're being not only hit by waves out at the beach, but at times pulled under by them?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think, that certainty comes in some, I think there's a lot of different things that we can do to kind of at least give ourselves some micro moments of security to recognize where we have control and where we don't. And that's something that our brains actually can work against us, because when we're perceiving threat, where our brain is naturally going to pull us is in the area of least control. So it's going to create a preoccupation with circumstances that we actually can't control. And the more that we become consumed with those circumstances, the more anxious and uncertain we feel. And our brain will actually not even offer us the places where we do have that control. So I think, that's an investigation worth doing for ourselves in our own kind of emotional lives, is to really look at and take an inventory of what is it that I actually can control in my world, right? In my space, in my time. Right. I think, a big piece that I've offered my clients is that routine and structure is so important right now. And it's hard because it's very counterintuitive. We typically rely on life to give us structure, right? Jobs or places to go or appointments to keep. And so we don't have a lot of practice or experience with how to be able to integrate that into our lives and be responsible for that for ourselves. So the inclination is to kind of sleep in and to kind of just, meander around our day. And there's a price that we pay psychologically for taking that approach in our lives, because that's really one of the places that we can control and we can get authority over, and it can actually create that feeling of security that we most need right now.
So I think I'm hearing you say that an importance of a routine that we had prior to the pandemic, or maybe establishing new routines.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be somewhat cautious to start too many new routines. I think if they're small, one of the things I recommended is small practice, like creating a compound effect where you spend maybe 5-10 minutes a day doing something that's fairly simple. I don't know that starting something super big is probably a good idea, but creating, like, the way that what works for me and what I think works for our human brains is to plan our day. This is what I'm going to do. This is when I'm going to wake up. Even if it's just, this is when I'm going to do the laundry, right? And this is when I'm going to prepare meals, because that kind of predictability in our own day-to-day life is actually quite soothing, and it's calming, and it helps us to feel like we can get some authority over our lives. And to bring in the yoga practice, for instance, I think that kind of practice can be so helpful at a time like this, to be able to do something that is a practice, right? That we're committing to, that we're showing up for, and that, we're doing on a regular basis. That, again, is a very calming kind of thing for us as humans.
Yeah, I agree with you. And can you offer some practical tips? Because when we're practicing yoga, it's great. We're completely involved in the practice. And I find that it's maybe a couple of hours later that talking begins again in the mind, because I'm not necessarily focused as intensely as I was in the yoga practice. What tips can help us when we begin not only to feel that sense of anxiety, but to literally feel like you have no control over your brain? I heard you say recently, and I've really been trying to embody, actually visualize what you said. You said something, and correct me if I didn't get it just right, that our minds, if sort of left to their own, are like 2-year-olds running around the house with a knife. And I just love that, because it's like a 2-year-old, you can just see them opening up all the cupboards, stabbing the knife and drawing with it in somebody's beautifully painted wall. So when those, it's like crazy brain begins, what can we do?
Yeah, I love that question. I got that actually from Brooke Castillo, and I love that one too. It's like our brains are toddlers, like you said, running around with a knife, innocently doing lots of damage. And they have to be supervised. We have to actually supervise our brains and not just leave them to their own devices. And I think that's one of the risks right now, is that we can kind of leave our brains to their own devices and end up having, the struggle that you're talking about, where the anxiety really ramps up. And so, one thing that I think is important, in terms of, like you're saying about the anxiety, is to recognize that fear particularly in a situation like this where you have this pervasive uncertainty is not a problem. It's actually a normal human response to perceived danger or threat or danger to those that we love. And where the problem comes in is when we make it a problem, when we experience fear and then we become afraid of the fear. Mm-hmm. And if we're afraid enough of the fear, that's when you start to see more panic responses and things like that. So this again is a bit of a practice that could be weaved in with yoga, which is to be able to allow that fear is a natural response in our bodies and in our brains and to situations that we can't control. And that's where we can give ourselves grace, is to be able to note it. Because one of the things that happens is, so fear is actually a vibration in the body. It's a vibrational energy in our body that's actually coming from our brain. It happens very fast, so we're not necessarily aware of the actual thoughts that are driving that fear. But what's happening very quickly is that our brain is perceiving threat and danger, and now we have a vibration happening in our body. And so being able to hold the space for that vibration and note it, like, this is fear. This is what fear feels like, or this is anxiety. And to be able to, and even I just saw you take a deep breath, right? Just right. Like to be able to identify it and note it and kind of like touch it tenderly, to just say, there it is. And to stay in that body space, because what we want to do is solve it, right? We're like, oh God, and then our brains, all that energy goes into our brain, and then we're trying to I think I need to do a lot more dishes, or I need to do another load of laundry, or and so now we're kind of off to the races, and it doesn't soothe us. It actually kind of increases our anxiety. So when we can bring that energy down, and I think yoga is a beautiful practice there, to be able to hold the vibration in our body and not see it as a problem, and be very intentional that, this is fear, and I can allow fear, because fear will move. It's like an asana, right? You hold the asana and you feel the way that the body wants to contract against it. And then if you can breathe, right? You take that deep breaths, right? And then the muscles will start to shift and move, and you feel it like the tide, right? It starts to kind of subside a little bit. You ride those waves. And if we can do that, that's where we can hold ourselves through the uncertainty, through the fear, and be able to get kind of on the other side without getting caught in this place where we're, right? Like ramping it up and getting more and more afraid. Does that make sense?
It makes great sense, and I appreciate you tying it back to the yoga. If you've never heard me talk about my first yoga teacher, Anita, Julie is her daughter, and we became fast friends in her mom's yoga classes. And her mother was a brilliant teacher who held your attention from the moment you entered her classroom. What I love about what you were saying is, it is about having this conscious recognition that there is an emotion, in this example, fear or anxiety arising. And then with that same sort of awareness that we observe the right foot, or we observe the left hip in yoga, we see what it is and we make a course correction. Can you talk a little bit about compassion for ourselves? Because I often observe students become impatient with themselves when they're in the yoga practice. How do we continue to soothe ourselves and offer ourselves compassion when we're dealing with something so frightening and unknown?
I love that question. Yeah. I see compassion I see that impatience, right? The difficulty, the struggle we have with compassion as as oftentimes another form of resisting what is. It's another form of contracting against reality and setting ourselves up for a power struggle that we're always going to lose. So when judgment comes up in my mind, I try to open a space for curiosity, to say, what's going on? What's bothering you? What's scaring you? What's happening here? Because judgment's, very seductive, impatience, intolerance, right? It actually is a form of psychological certainty. So in a way, it's a way of trying to soothe ourselves by somewhat kind of making up what we're right about. Like, oh, it shouldn't be happening like this, or I should be doing it faster, or I should be doing it better, or I should be doing more, or should be doing less, or, that sort of thing. And I always say we can't be in judgment and aware at the same time. Because if we're in judgment, we're in certainty. And in order to be able to change something, to shift something, we have to be aware of it. So I think being intentional about this and recognizing that when we're impatient, it's like the canary in the coal mine. In other words, it's a signal, it's an alarm that says, something else is happening, vibrating underneath that. And my mind is trying to get me out of it, right? We try to get out of it. It's so uncomfortable, right? This is very uncomfortable. It's like holding a yoga pose that's very stressful. That's a little, that edge where it's like a little scary. Like, I don't know, like we were doing the sliding and gliding, right? It's like you kind of slide that leg out and you're like, I don't know if this is really what my body's supposed to do. And so there's that moment of like, I don't know if I can do this, right? And being able to acknowledge that and open that space, but we have to do it intentionally. We have to override that limbic brain that's going to want to resist and contract. And we have to step in and say, oh, here's one of those moments, and take that breath and invite more information, more like turning toward ourselves, leaning into what that resistance is when we're feeling judgmental or intolerant of ourselves, and being able to see if we can find what's happening like under that space. But I think this place of compassion, of giving ourselves grace and space, is really such an important key. And to really do this intentionally, to be willing, right? Willingness is such an important piece. Like, am I willing to be compassionate with myself? Am I willing to allow that I may not actually know, how things should be, or, how it all should go? And that can be scary, but it can also be very transformative.
It is scary. And I think realizing that we're all experiencing it, that there is this shared humanity, really shared humanity throughout the globe, of everyone experiencing to some degree everything that you and I are experiencing, that's so uncomfortable at times.
Yes, exactly. We're all experiencing different levels of discomfort or comfort. Some people are feeling pretty comfortable with being at home. But it's how we respond, right, to the circumstances, which is as varied as our unique selves, right? Mm-hmm. How we respond to it. So the circumstance itself is a fixed, right, experience, right? That there is the coronavirus, but how we respond to it, that's really where our power is. That's really where our ability to choose compassion over judgment, or our ability to decide how we want to show up, or how the practice that we want to be practicing, right? How we might want to use this as something that's happening for us instead of something that's happening to us, right?
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you, I realize that it really hasn't occurred to me. Wow, there probably are people that are totally happy being at home. There are people that didn't have to close businesses. There are people that maybe in some ways their lives haven't changed all that much if they're working from home. And so
That's
we
right.
become, yeah, you become so myopic, focused on yourself, in this case, moi self, that we forget I'm just one little drop, you're just one little drop in this sea of humanity.
Yeah, exactly. And, the difference there is what we make it mean. It's what we make it mean. If we make it mean that, this is horrible, this is the worst thing that could have happened, right? We're going to have a different emotional experience. We're going to show up in a very different way. If we make it mean that, oh, this is actually giving me a break. I've had people that said, God, I've been waiting like for life to stop, like the life train to stop so I could just like take a break, and some people, that's what they're making it mean, like, this is my break, right? Where other people are saying this is horrible, right? The worst thing that can happen. So, and what happened, our brain will tell us that we don't have an option, that not only is that what we make it mean, but that's the truth. Our brains are engineered to give us information that we interpret as being very reliable. And that's not a problem. The problem is that when it's actually giving us information that's causing us suffering, right, then it's worth questioning whether that's actually reliable or not. Whether that's actually true. Yeah?
Sorry, that gives us back the power then.
Exactly.
So talk a little bit about post-pandemic and what about post-trauma, because I can't imagine that whenever we all leave our homes and return to whatever our new normal looks like, that there won't be some residue that remains with us psychologically and emotionally.
Yeah, right. I agree with you. So, 7 to 8% of people, right, have post-traumatic stress symptoms. So in other words, their brain interprets the experience as being traumatic, and that sets up a whole response system in our limbic brain, and that generally doesn't go away with time. That actually tends to freeze, and so it stays fairly static. So in other words, someone who, as a result of this, might come out of it, one of that 7 or 8% that has post-traumatic stress disorder. So a year from now, right, they would think about this and they would have exactly the same emotional distress, that level of emotional distress. It doesn't tend to go away with time. We get adapted to it where we're not thinking about it all the time, but when we do think about it, it's going to bring up all that distress. But for the 92% of people that are not actually going to have post-traumatic stress, it's not that they're not going to maybe have some residual stress, but that's different, right? I think it's worth considering something that's been relatively new in terms of social research, which is post-traumatic growth, right? Is how we can use adverse circumstances in our lives to actually grow, that having things happen that are not in our control can actually make us stronger, and that there are things that we can do to build that skill to be able to cultivate growth in that way. And it's certainly worth probably some research on your students' part to really look into this, or what is post-traumatic growth? How can I get some of that, right? That sounds good. I want some of that. So I think, that's something that's even just as a concept, like, is that even possible, right? Post-traumatic growth, right? That's beautiful. The idea that we could become stronger and more resilient as a result of something that would be considered a pretty adverse experience.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Right?
What if I don't want to do the research myself and I say, listen, it sounds like you've done a lot of research. how could someone reach out to you and start a dialogue about the things that you and I have spoken about here today?
Well, a couple of different things. I mean, I have a private practice, right? So, and they could reach out to me to set up a consult. We could talk about what they would maybe be wanting some help with. I also have an email blog, so I send out some information, kind of like what I'm talking about on a weekly basis. And I'm putting together that course, like you said. I'm super excited about that. So I'm going to be doing a webinar sometime in June. It's going to be a free training. I think it's called How to Go From Stuck to Unstoppable, something like that. So, and it'll offer a tool to be able to again, apply some of the things that I'm talking about and support people in this post-traumatic growth to be able to use experiences like what we're facing, you know, right now in the world, to be able to actually feel more capable in themselves, more trust in themselves. And certainly it can be utilized in that way, but generally not with some sort of help, because again, our brains are not actually wired for post-traumatic growth. Like that's something we actually have to work on. Left to its own devices, we're talking about that toddler, right? That's not going to happen. So, but if we have the tools and we have some guidance and we have the support and we have, you know, yoga teachers and, you know, and therapists and coaches, right, that we can really find our way, I think, to kind of use this as a way to build grit and to become, you know, better versions of ourselves. And I think certainly your students, right, are very committed to evolving and to wanting to be the best version of themselves. And so admire that.
Oh, thank you. And I, having known you now for more years than probably either of us would want to admit to, I know that there's a real practical and comforting experience to working with you, that just being with you in and of itself can be very comfortable, comforting, very soothing. So could people find you at your website, juliemsimons.com? What's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, no, exactly. Go to my website, juliemsimons.com. I am on Facebook, Julie Simons LCSW, and they can email me, julie@juliemsimons.com. Yeah, so those are all. I'm kind of on the internet, so if you look me up, with Sarasota, Florida, you'd probably find me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've noticed on Facebook you have. Does it say tele? Yeah, so somebody can talk to you in the comfort of their own home.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is huge, right? That we're able, and that you know, this is really becoming the way, right? Right now I'm only doing remote sessions, and so you know, it's fantastic that we're able to stay connected in this way, right? That we live in a time of this kind of technology, to be able to look at your beautiful face and to have these kinds of exchanges and to be able to share with people. And it's so interesting. I feel actually quite close to so many people right now. And even though I'm literally, I mean, this is probably my 7th week of just being in my house, but so it's wonderful that we have this technology. What a gift.
And it's wonderful that you're available for all of us to learn how we can experience this post-trauma growth. Thank you for taking and making the time, Julie.
Oh, it's such a pleasure anytime, Lynn. You and your students, so near and dear to my heart, and it's just a joy to spend some time with you. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Namaste, my friend.
Namaste.